Iran would have negative consequences for the Middle East, stability in general, and also directly for our allies in the region. Iran is extremely volatile and could easily overreact to provocation. An attack at this stage, therefore, would be disastrous. Any attack without American support would hinder but not stop the Iranian nuclear program. Our right honourable friend for Kensington is right in saying, however, that taking the possibility of an attack off the table would make Israel more likely to act unilaterally in order to retard Iran's program. So what do we do? I think that the only thing we can do is to continue with economic sanctions and be realistic about their likely impact, to recognise Iranian concerns and not engage in too much sabre rattling, recognise that this is a proud nation, they feel themselves surrounded, all that is very wise. So try and take this issue off the boil, keep them guessing. And I think that's why I'm sorry I have to say to my honourable friend for Billericay, I can't support his motion today. I think it is wildly dangerous now to remove from the table the threat of military action. I don't believe it's necessary. I believe, as I said earlier, that when you're dealing with tyrannies, and surely this is the verdict of history, you have to keep them guessing. But the verdict of history also from the 1930s, and the Foreign Office had a policy of keeping our potential enemy guessing the 1930s. Ultimately, that policy was also disastrous because there was no certainty about our intent. So I come to my very final conclusion, that there should be no preemptive strike, that we should keep talking, that we should keep them guessing. But ultimately, the Iranian regime has to know that if they are on the brink of acquiring nuclear weapons, then the West, namely America and Israel, at that stage will act. And they have to act to defend all our freedoms and to defend stability in the entire region.
Chris Bryant. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was with the honourable gentleman for so much of his speech until we got to the very end. But the same, I have to say, is true of the honourable gentleman for Basildon and Billericay, because I confess I started the day rather sympathetic to his motion, in large measure because the first preferred profession for many people in my constituency, as has been shown in many opinion polls, and also true across many former mining constituencies, is the armed forces. And I don't want to send more British armed forces, young people from the Rhondda, to go and have to fight in a war a long way from home, which may have no discernible goal and may have a very uncertain future. But I have to say to him that I did not find his argument persuasive. In fact, I found it completely the opposite of persuasive. I found it deeply unpersuasive, and I won't be able to support him tonight. This is not about whether we like or dislike the Iranian regime. I don't think there can be anybody in this House who likes the Iranian regime. Whether that's because of its phenomenal and extraordinary use of the death penalty. They own up to 252 cases last year, but it's probably far more likely to be 600, which puts them second only to China, and China being so much larger a country. 143 people under the age of 18 are on the death row at the moment in that country. It's a security state in the way that the former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, described the term in the late 1930s. They have laws against harming national security, against disturbing public order, but also against insulting public officials. And they use them for anything that whenever they want to repress dissent. I found the honourable member's argument about Israel to be frankly naive, I'm afraid. I would very rarely use that in this House, but I honestly think that to argue a pedantic argument about the semantics of what Ahmadinejad said or didn't say is neither here nor there. The truth is that there is a very strong, powerful body of opinion within the leadership in the Iranian regime, which is wholly inimical to the success of the Israeli state. And whatever criticism I may have about Israel and its failure to adhere to United Nations resolutions and the rest, I believe that Israelis have the right to self-determination and to believe that they can live in their country in security and honesty. Of course I will.
The honourable member should be a little careful with his words. One isn't arguing for one moment, and I certainly didn't, that there aren't those within Iran, many within Iran, who absolutely loathe the state of Israel. There are many Arabs and Jews within the state of Israel that disagree with their own government on many issues. But that cannot justify military intervention. And the honourable member needs to be careful when he talks about naivety, when I would suggest to him it is completely naive, pursuing failed policies.
Well, the honourable gentleman hasn't heard the rest of what I'm going to say, so perhaps he'll be less unhappy with some of the rest of what I'm going to say, but I would argue back to him that, in actual fact, the theocratic argument that is used by many in Iran, including very senior figures in the regime, and those who have direct access to military power in the regime, may at some point lead to direct assaults on Israel, and I think it would be only understandable for the Israelis to want to protect themselves. And in that set of circumstances, Ahmadinejad could perfectly easily have said, "I'm terribly sorry, I gather there's been a terrible misinterpretation of what I said that has gone around the world, and I'd like to correct it, because I didn't mean that Israel could be wiped from the map." There are other reasons why I hate the regime, of course. Their record on LGBT rights, which I've referred to in many speeches over the years, is quite shocking, but it's interesting that they're actually getting worse. In September of last year, 3 young men were executed on the crime of lavat, which is consent for homosexuality. In the past, they've always tried to maintain that all these cases were non-consensual homosexuality, and in this occasion, they have actually owned up that basically they're executing people for consensual homosexuality. I would also highlight what they've done to the Awazi Arabs. Quite often, these are people who are completely forgotten because they don't fit into many people's understanding of what Iran must look like, and certainly not what Ahmadinejad's version of Iran looks like. But on September the 4th, in September last year, 4 Awazis were sentenced to death for, the term was for enmity against God. Likewise, only very recently, a 19-year-old, Nazar Albo-Ashoka, died under torture, another Awazi. And the repression of the Awazis has gone on for many years. This is also not about whether any of us believe that Iran should have nuclear weapons. I don't think there's anybody in this House that would support Iran having nuclear weapons. It is about the possible potential justice or injustice, rightness or wrongness of possible military intervention. And there are a series of questions I think we always need to ask ourselves before we engage in military action. The first, is the action of the aggressor certain? Are we certain that they are either in doing this or going to do this? I think at this moment it is not absolutely certain. I'm fairly convinced of what the Iranian regime intends to do with their military capability, but it is not absolutely certain that they intend aggression. Is this a grave ill or a major act of aggression? The second question we have to ask. Well, it's not as grave, thus far that we have got, it is not as grave as many of the other things that have happened in other countries, not least Syria. Are there other... yes, of course I will.
I thank the Honourable Member for taking an intervention. I must say I'm very engaged with everything that he is saying. But does he agree with me that nobody wants to go down this road of action against Israel? And does he take the same comfort as me from the first line in the amendment? That what we all want to see is the British government and the governments of the world doing everything they can to secure a peaceful agreement, a peaceful resolution to the issue we face, and that all we are discussing is keeping on the back burner, as distant as we can, any idea of military action.
Well, yes, sort of, but I'll come back to the points that the Honourable Gentleman raises, if he doesn't mind, in a moment, because I think we have to analyse, are there better means of achieving the same end that we want? And I think, as the Home Secretary himself said today, and the Shadow Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, sorry, said earlier, there clearly still are better means which we have not yet exhausted, which we need to pursue to their logical end. Would there be a clear goal if military action were to be taken against Iran? I think it's very difficult to see what that clear goal would look like. Similarly, would it be achievable if we knew what that goal would be? As the Honourable Member for Gainsborough said, it's very difficult to see how it would be possible to achieve that secure goal. would it be proportionate, not only proportionate to the aggression that's being shown, but also proportionate to the action that we choose to take in other cases, because otherwise we might be accused of hypocrisy. And this is undoubtedly true for many countries when they look at how we choose to implement or force the implementation of United Nations resolutions in relation to Israel, but not in relation to others. And similarly, is there a danger that the outcome of military action might be even worse than the result of not engaging in military action? And that's the toughest question always. Always the toughest question for us. We look at what's happening in Syria at the moment, and our heart goes out to people. But would military intervention from the West at the moment make for a better situation or a worse? I think it's still uncertain, incidentally, whether our intervention in Libya and elsewhere will really produce the goods that we had always hoped for. And I have a real worry, Mr. Speaker, about what I would call the ratchet effect, which is today we're forceful in our language. Tomorrow, forceful isn't enough, so we've got to be assertive. And then the next time, we've got to be aggressive, and then we've got to be pugnacious, and then we've got to be belligerent, and then bellicose, and then we find ourselves at the doorsteps of war. And I would argue that that is in part what happened in relation to the step up towards the military intervention in Iraq. And I think we have to be very dangerous. And I would just say to the Foreign Secretary, who in many regards, I won't if he doesn't mind, the Foreign Secretary is a very persuasive man in many cases, but sometimes I think he is so eloquent that his language ratchets things up. I won't if he doesn't mind, because I've taken 2 interventions and there are others who wish to speak. So I worry that, like a spanner that you can ratchet up but you can't take back down, if we use language that is exorbitant and goes too far, we will end up in a situation where, from no real decision of our own, we may be at the steps of dawn. The Honourable Gentleman says, I understand that they ratchet up as well, but this is true too in relation to the Falklands. The Argentinians can huff and puff for all they want, but I think quite often it's best just to leave them huffing and puffing rather than to rattle a sabre back at them. I think there are 2 things that, in closing, that I would say. First, that we do have to put considerable trust in the European Union process. This is one of the areas where going it alone for the UK is unlikely to achieve great success. Not that anybody's proposing that, but just going it alone with Israel and the United States of America, or a coalition of the willing, or whatever you want to call it, would not be a good idea. Binding in the E3+3 has been an extremely, thus far, successful process, and it has thus far avoided war. And the final point I'd make is that Israel, I believe, contrary to what the Honourable Member for Gainsborough said, would be wholly wrong to take unilateral action. I don't think it will be able to. I don't think it would be successful if it chose to do so. But if they were to take from this decision tonight that we believe they should take military action, they would be wrong.
Mr. Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by welcoming and congratulating my honourable friend for Basildon and Billericay. This has been an incredibly important debate, and one that personally I'm very glad we've had the chance to have, because if you were to ask me about this subject 12 months ago, I had spoken out in favour of the motion that the honourable member has put on the record today. That was my original position. And to understand my original position, it comes from a simple fact that I want to try and do everything we can possibly do in this place as politicians to make sure that we don't kill innocent people. And I think that any politician needs to start from that position and say that we must try and do everything we can possibly do to not kill innocent people. And when you talk about a campaign in Iran, you wonder, what would you actually do? Would you drop bombs from 36,000 feet in built-up areas? Would you put ground troops on the ground? The Iran-Iraq war, 1 million dead, 1 mile covered, 8 years. That was with the full backing of a landlocked country with Western support. So you wonder where you go. But you have to look at a bigger picture. And I actually believe that my sentiments back then were, in the words of the Right Honourable Member for Rhondda, naive. They were a naive position for me to take. Because you don't actually need to use a nuclear weapon to have a devastating effect on the region if you so wish. The Iranians would like to believe that they have a right to some of the United Arab Emirates countries. They could walk into those islands, they could occupy them through totally conventional force. But the threat in the background of a nuclear weapon means, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do if they're at that stage with that nuclear weapon? What suffering will be met out on those people in those countries? And equally, a lot's been said tonight about a proxy war. A proxy war which could only be ratcheted up, I believe, if Iran was a nuclear-capable country. Organisations such as Hezbollah and Hamas, I feel, would be empowered by the fact they could be bolder in their terrorist activities and the steps they take towards the State of Israel, simply because they know they would have such a powerful ally standing behind them. What really is going to be planted out on those organisations if behind them lies a nuclear weapon? I remember clearly, I wasn't in this House, I was elected in 2010, but I remember clearly watching the debates leading up to a long time before the Iraq War. And I remember listening very clearly to Tony Benn, who stood from this side of the House and said, it is too sensationalist, some of the war with the 24-hour news coverage, and there are too many people out there who revel in the fact of bombs dropping on Baghdad and seeing those things happen. And I think that we have a problem at the moment with the 24-hour news cycle and what we do, in the sense there's almost a demand wanting some military action in these countries because it makes such great television pictures. It appeals to people. It's entertainment for them. The reality is far more harsh. I equally remember the speech by my honourable friend for Keighley when we discussed the Libya campaign, and he very graphically described what the reality of war is. The photographs that have been brought back to him from colleagues he served with in the armed forces, of burnt bodies, of dismembered bodies. As the honourable gentleman for Hayes and Harlington, sorry, I don't think it was Hayes and Harlington, but one of the honourable gentlemen from the opposite side described one of his constituents who just took his own life through the mental trauma he has suffered through Afghanistan. I think it was Newport West, yeah, my apologies. So it is never an easy decision to talk about military action. I have said in this House before that a war is the failure of politicians. It is the failure of people like us, in the safety of this House, in this country, to not work within an organisation. But does that mean that we should hamstring ourselves at the start and say that no matter what you do, there will be no military interaction? The military action could simply be provoked upon us in the Straits of Hormuz. If that waterway is closed off, if British shipping is attacked, if any shipping is attacked, and we have minesweepers in the area, etc., and other ships, we would have no choice but to react. If we pass this resolution today saying we will take no military action, then that sends out an even worse signal to the world. But because I will be supporting the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend for Kensington this evening, does not mean that I don't have sympathy with the motion put down by my honourable friend for Basildon and Billericay. Because the one thing we must always do, and I think it's been a very intelligent, heartfelt and engaging debate this afternoon and this evening. And the one message which has come from every person who's spoken, whether they are for the amendment or for the original motion, has been, we want to avoid military action. But I have been slightly concerned, Mr. Speaker, that the debate at times has appeared to be discussing military action tomorrow. Military action tomorrow is not on the agenda. It is simply not on the agenda. And if next week the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister came to this House and said, we are going with the Americans to attack Iran because we can't go any further, I don't think this House would support that. I don't think the mood would be in this House at this stage of events to support that sort of military intervention. But I come back to this point, that is not what we have discussed today. It's discussed whether we remove that option completely from the table. And I don't believe we can. Yes, we need to work hard diplomatically, Yes, we need to work with countries like Russia and China. We must have far better diplomatic negotiations with Russia to try and push Iran away from a nuclear proliferation, to make sure it does stay on those energy needs, because I'm quite sure that they don't want to see a nuclear-armed Iran and then maybe an escalation in the Middle East as much as anybody else does. But unfortunately, they, through to other reasons, are not prepared to support the United Nations and the West in those areas. So, as much as I absolutely have faith in the Foreign Secretary, and I really do, I think this Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Office have moved the Foreign Office into a new position of standing in the world, something where it had declined in recent years. And I think it is well respected, and the people in it well respected. And as the Foreign Secretary said in his opening statements, there is an entire section of the Foreign Office engaged purely on negotiations with Iran and diplomacy in those areas. That is to be applauded. That is to be where we all hope in this House, I would imagine, we want this situation to move to. But that does not mean that we can take the military option off the table, as much as none of us actually want to use it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate again my honourable friend for securing the debate. Whilst I disagree with everything he said, I'm grateful for that he challenges my views and those of others who oppose his motion. And I've got three fundamental points to make. First, the honourable gentleman said there was no smoking gun. Well, I would argue actually there's a big smoking gun, and that Iran is building a nuclear bomb. Second, their nuclear programme is not a response to sanctions. It was happening already. And third, if Iran had a bomb, we cannot be sure that they would not use one, either directly or indirectly through one of the many terrorist organisations they support. And it's worth examining these points in turn. First, is Iran building a nuclear bomb? Now, the IAEA report from November 2011 clearly states that Iran has acquired the knowledge, the technology and the resources to create a nuclear bomb within months. Its main findings were, and I quote from Section G, paragraph 43, that Iran has procured nuclear-related equipment and materials, acquired nuclear weapons development information and documentation from a clandestine nuclear supply network, and worked on the development of an indigenous design of a nuclear weapon, including the testing of components. But put this aside for 1 minute. What do Arab nations in the region say? They are in no doubt what the Iranians are planning. As far back as in 2008, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia urged the United States to cut the head off the snake and halt Iran's nuclear program. Last week I was in Kurdistan in northern Iraq, and the Kurds know too well what a nuclear Iran would be, and incredibly concerned about the implications. And that is what is at stake in the region. Now, this is not a response to sanctions. We cannot appease Iran or hope for moderates to emerge from within the regime. Nuclear ambition is not a response to sanctions. It was happening already. United Nations sanctions began in 2006 in response to Iran's refusal to suspend uranium enrichment. But as far back as 2002, the National Council of Resistance of Iran revealed Iran's secret nuclear program, much of which was later admitted by the Iranian leadership on state television. Tehran has repeatedly dismissed calls to negotiate, and President Ahmadinejad now insists his nuclear program is unstoppable. The only time Iran has suspended uranium enrichment, cooperated with the UN and signed the full non-proliferation treaty was in October 2003. Why October 2003? Because at that time, 250,000 of Western troops had just toppled Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and they were close to Iran's western border. As soon as that threat diminished, Iran returned to its nuclear program, which has led us to this point today. Now, third, we cannot be sure that Iran would not use a nuclear bomb. Iranian leaders have made numerous statements calling for the destruction of the State of Israel and the Jewish people. Just last week, the Iranian website Aleph published an article by Khomeini's strategy chief, Alizera Fogani, detailing plans for the extermination of Israel. As British newspapers have reported, the dossier even pinpoints the housing estates with the highest concentration of Jewish people. Now, this piece, which is now being run on most state Iran-owned sites, says that because of the United States presidential elections, the time for Iran to strike is now. Last week, Iran's defense ministry announced that it tested a two-stage ballistic missile which could deliver a nuclear bomb. Earlier this month, the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel said he had intelligence showing that these missiles had a range of 6,200 kilometres, enough to hit the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, I've described in the House as a past that Iran is the new Soviet Union of the Middle East. It represses its people at home and it has expansionist aims abroad. It's widely recognised as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. It provides support to insurgent groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have attacked and killed British troops. And a nuclear Iran does not just mean a nuclear Iran. It means a nuclear Hezbollah, a nuclear Hamas, and so forth. As former Iranian President and Ayatollah Rafsanjani said, application of an atomic bomb would not leave anything in Israel. But the extremists in charge of Iran do not just see their conflict as with their neighbours, they also see it with the West. That is why they threatened to bomb Turkey last year. In 2006, Hassan Abbasi, the head of the Iranian Centre for Strategic Studies, said Britain's demise is on our agenda. He also added that we have a strategy drawn up for the destruction of Anglo-Saxon civilization. We must make use of everything we have at hand to strike at this front by means of our suicide operations or by means of missiles. Now, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has described the Iranian nuclear threat as the new Cold War. But it may be worse, because in the past, nuclear deterrence worked because of mutually assured destruction, MAD, and clear lines of communication. But for MAD to work, you have to be sane, and the Iranian regime has shown itself not to be. As we see from their constant human rights abuse, their attacks on the British Embassy and their support for terrorism. Now, let this be a lesson for the free world. I mentioned last week that I'd been in Kurdistan near the Iranian border, and I met with Iranian Kurds who are persecuted by the Iranian regime. They again knew the reality of a nuclear Iran, and they said the only way it would change if there was regime change in Iran, and they asked why the West had not done more to support democratic and opposition movements in Iran, which would have made some difference and perhaps help facilitate regime change. Finally, if I just want to quote Niall Ferguson, who wrote recently in Newsweek, "War is an evil, but sometimes a preventative war can be a lesser evil and a policy of appeasement. The people who don't know that are the ones still in denial about what a nuclear-armed Iran would end up costing us all."
Order. I intend to call the honourable gentleman member for Basildon and Billericay at 9:56 to wind up the debate. Until then, Mr James Morris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And could I pay tribute to the honourable member for Basildon and Billericay for securing this debate. Now, I think we need to be clear about the danger that the world would face from a nuclear-armed Iran. As other honourable members have said, it is a state widely recognised as the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism. It funds, trains and arms groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And as the right honourable gentleman just said, it would be a grim prospect for the cause of peace in the Middle East if these terrorist groups gain the protection of an Iranian nuclear umbrella. Now, Mr Speaker, the belligerence of the regime is perhaps explained by its expanding conventional missile programme. The Iranian regime has a large arsenal of missiles which have a range of 1,300 kilometres. They have the capability, Mr Speaker, of threatening Gulf states. Now, as other honourable members have said, a nuclear-armed Iran would spark a nuclear arms race as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, perhaps Egypt, all sought to counter Iran's regional hegemony. Now, some argue, and some have argued in this debate tonight, that the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran is exaggerated, and that in any case we would be able to contain the threat. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that those honourable gentlemen and others outside this place who argue that are living in a dream world. Containment of a nuclear-armed Iran would require overwhelming force and huge military deployment in the Middle East, and we would need to confront Israel's terrorist proxies. Now, with the current conditions in the Middle East, that is not a realistic long-term option given the instability in the region. Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe we have a responsibility to stop Iran ever becoming a nuclear-armed power. And the Foreign Secretary is right to say, and other honourable members have been right to say, that all options must be left on the table. And we are right, and the Foreign Secretary is also right, to pursue an aggressive sanctions policy. Now, there is lots of evidence, Mr. Speaker, that the sanctions regime is beginning to bite, but I believe that it could go further. Now, the assets of the Iranian Central Bank have been frozen in Europe, but there are limited exemptions to permit some legitimate trade. Now, US sanctions do not include these exemptions. I believe that EU banking sanctions must be tightened up to bring them more in line with those imposed by the United States. We should also look more closely, Mr. Speaker, at the shipping industry. The Islamic Republic of Iran shipping line has been renaming and re-registering cargo ships to avoid sanctions. The IRISL has renamed 90 of its 123 ships since 2008. And given that Britain is a hub of shipping insurance, we need to work to make sure that these legal loopholes which are being exploited by the Iranian regime are closed. Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe, as other honourable gentlemen have said, that we must do everything we can to prevent Iran from achieving its nuclear ambitions. And the Foreign Secretary is right to work with our international partners across the European community and across the world to make sure that the sanctions that have been agreed are beginning to bite and will continue to bite. But as I have said, I believe that more needs to be done in order to tighten up the sanctions regime which has been imposed on Iran. Iran poses, Mr. Speaker, a major threat to peace and stability in the Middle East, and I believe it must not be allowed under any circumstances to get a nuclear weapon. Thank you.
Mr. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it can be safely said that I have been in a very small minority this evening. But at the same time, I would like to thank all members, honourable and right honourable members, for participating in this debate. The extent of interest, particularly on a one-line whip, I think has proved that it has been a worthwhile debate, and there's been many interesting contributions. I remain of the view, though, that the government and opposition have failed to address various points. There have been opportunities missed by both sides to better relations between Iran and the West. The present policy of sanctions and sabre-rattling has failed. Iran will not be deterred, and yet the policy has brought us to the brink of military conflict. A military strike by Israel, something that I think was accepted by most, would be a disaster. It would unite Iran in fury behind the hardliners in the country. It would not work. It would only delay matters for perhaps a year at most, and it could lead to a regional war. Those who think otherwise are very wrong indeed. Yet the government and the opposition keep this option of force on the table, despite the fact it would be disastrous, despite the fact that Iran ignores it, and despite the fact that it increases tensions and makes a peaceful outcome less likely. My contention is that by ruling it out, we would reduce the tensions, bring us back from the brink of military conflict, and give diplomacy a greater chance. I suggest that there has been no answer to my suggestion that the time has come for a fresh approach, which recognises the status of Iran as a regional superpower. We need to better understand and engage with Iran. The precedent for this new relationship, I suggest to the House, is Nixon's rapprochement with the Chinese during the 1960s and 1970s. After all, China and the West had been at war in Korea just a decade before. And the US needs to make it very clear to Israel that military action will not be acceptable. But I see no appetite for this here in the House tonight. I think this is a defining moment which we are missing. Now, I hope that most of us, not all listening to the contributions tonight, but most of us can accept that war should be the measure of last resort, to be used when all other avenues have been exhausted. My belief, in contrast to a lot of the contributions here tonight, is that we have not reached that point yet. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I shall be opposing the amendment to my motion this evening.
Order. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.